Practice 7.2, we're going to continue looking at measurement of training, but we're going to look at anthropomorphic and non-fatiguing types of assessment. So next time you're at a family gathering, someone might ask you, hey, how's school going? And you're like, yeah, it's going great. I'm in scientific conditioning athletes class, and we're looking at anthropomorphic assessment of training. And they're like, whoa, that college is really paying off for you, right? So anthropomorphic is it's a cool word to say, and we'll define what that means here. So basically, when we do these types of assessment of training, we want to go from easiest, non-fatiguing, to more exertion or longer duration in implementing the tests. So that's where we begin with non-fatiguing. So that would be things you can do while sitting still, with little motion or standing. And this would include those anthropomorphic things. So it's assessing like your heart rate, your blood pressure, assessing your body, basically. That's what anthropomorphic means. Then we move into a little bit more motion, range of motion, balance, stability, but not very fatiguing or very exertional, right? And then we move into the things that require more speed, power, and agility, right? The more fatiguing, more strenuous, but kind of short term. And then we move to the more fatiguing muscular or anaerobic types of activities. So this would be exerting a muscle till volitional failure, okay? This might be like 1 rep max or 5 rep max kind of tests. So you're lifting as much as you can until that muscle cannot move anymore. That would be a little bit later in those tests. And then typically if we do an aerobic assessment as well, this might be done on an additional day or after full recovery has occurred, so maybe half an hour or more after some of these other assessments. So that'd be things like the mile run perhaps, or a VO2 max type of test. So chances are you've done many of these before. So, right, some of these non-fatiguing things would be your medical history, right? As an athlete, typically before you can even compete, you have to complete your physical form. So, by going to the doctor or the trainer and having them approve your capacity for movement, for exercise. So you might have to predisclose any type of previous injury or illness, chronic conditions, and any medications we're taking. So as a coach, it'd be very beneficial for me to know if my athlete has asthma, especially exercise-induced asthma, if they have any type of cardiac issues, right, if they have diabetes. We had an athlete here on this campus that didn't disclose he had diabetes. He was, 22, 23 years old. He was at a golf tournament, and he collapsed out on like hole 15 or something like that because he didn't have lunch, and he went hypoglycemic. Okay, but coach didn't know. I didn't know he had diabetes. Even allergies like bee stings, right? A lot of outdoor sports, different medical conditions, we need to know those things. If they're taking any types of drugs or medication, a lot of times in the high school setting that those drugs are maybe contained within maybe the school office or the trainer, so they don't have easy access to those things, but some medications can increase blood pressure. Some medications can cause people to have excessive thirst or excessive urination, cause them to fatigue easier, or even be more sensitive to sunlight. So as a coach, those things are very helpful to know what's going on with our athletes. So again, as a student athlete, either high school or college, you need to have a physical medical clearance form on file. So I'll provide different examples of those, perhaps for your portfolio perhaps you can include something like that. If you go more into the private sector, like for personal training, perhaps, where you have paying clients that are paying you to help train them, typically we need to have a PAR-Q. It's called a participation questionnaire. And again, that goes through medical history, kind of like a physical would for a student athlete. Okay, I might talk more about that later, but now we move into the anthropomorphic assessment. So if you think of anthropology, that's like the study of humans, right? Human civilizations, human stuff like that. So anthropomorphic has to do with people or the person, right? So one thing we do is we can assess resting heart rate. And I'm going to go into a little more detail on each one of these here. So other things we can do is blood pressure, or height and weight charts. We can look at what our body's made out of. We kind of talked about this in the principles of fitness, or the components of fitness. We can look at body circumference and different posture things. So let's quick look at some of those things. So resting heart rate is typically assessed when somebody's been sitting for a half an hour or more quietly without moving. Ideally, the best time would be right when you wake up from sleep overnight. And then take your resting heart rate. So you can take a carotid artery or your radial artery. Okay? Easiest way to do is count how many beats you have in 15 seconds. Right? That would be your systolic blood pressure, that pulse you feel. Count for 15 seconds and then multiply by 4, and that gives you your beats per minute. Most of our athletes we're going to be looking at for high school or college might be this 18 to 25-year-old range. So if you look, women typically have a slightly higher resting heart rate. I won't go into that now, why that is right now, but they have typically 5 beats per minute faster than men. So if you look, anything under 60 for boys or men is typically pretty fit. And then anything really below 70 for women is a high level of fitness. Again, there's an inverse relationship between resting heart rate and fitness. So typically, the higher the fitness level we have, the lower resting heart rate we'll have because of cardiorespiratory functioning, right? The stroke volume, the cardiac output is higher. So again, this can be an assessment, right? An incoming assessment that if I have an athlete coming into my season and their resting heart rate is 65 as a 20-year-old male, I know they've deconditioned quite a bit and we need to get them, 10 beats per minute slower heart rate. Another thing is blood pressure. Right, blood pressure, you can get these fairly inexpensive blood pressure systems here. This one goes on the elbow. Others can go on the wrist. And again, this kind of gives us an idea, right, that somebody with a really low blood pressure might be susceptible to lightheadedness, even fainting. Okay, someone with high blood pressure, again, might be susceptible to perhaps fainting, but that might cap their exertion ceiling, right? That if they do too many kind of powerlifting things where it requires the Valsalva maneuver, we'll talk about that later, that might increase their blood pressure too much, and that can cause complications as well. Again, certain medications impact blood pressure. Then we have body composition. Some of you may have had this done. Body composition might be more pertinent to weight class types of sports like wrestling, boxing, gymnastics, skating. But it might be also useful for like endurance types of sports. I know of coaches who've required their distance runners to cut weight to get at a competitive weight. So what is an appropriate or an acceptable amount of weight one can lose? We have to have an assessment of what they currently have and predict what's potential. So if you read studies, the criterion or the best kind of gold standard, the most accurate, least margin of error, are DEXA, dual X-ray exam assessment. I'll have some links here that you can look at in Canvas. On campus, we do have hydrostatic weighing options, so if you take exercise physiology, you can probably do some of these things. But very big pieces of equipment that need dedicated space, they're very expensive to obtain, maintain, and operate. And we typically need someone trained like an exercise physiologist to operate and to interpret the results. Okay, so not super accessible to the general population. So mostly you're going to have what's called a field test. There's a little bit higher margin of error, but it's more practical. Right, so I wrestled in high school, and we all, at the beginning of the season, we had to have skin fold assessments done. So we had measurements taken throughout the body, and it gave us our percent body fat. And then from there, we determined what was acceptable weight class we could wrestle. Another thing we can do is it's called bioelectrical impedance. Maybe you've seen some of these things. Maybe even some fitness equipment has this stuff on it. Basically, you enter your height, weight, age, gender, activity level, and you hold this, and it kicks out your estimated body fat percent. A little bit more higher margin of error in here, but it is $50 for this thing, which is pretty cheap compared to anything. So we determine what our body fat percentage is. All right, so kind of what are these kind of ideal ranges? Again, different sports may have different ranges that we're looking for. Right, a football lineman might look different than a cross-country runner. Right. But how can we determine what is acceptable amount of weight to gain or lose? So I can take my body weight, let's say I weigh 170 pounds, and then based on some body fat analysis, I can determine what my percent body fat is. So let's say mine is 22%. So that would put me as a male kind of in this acceptable range. So if I take my 170 pounds times my percent body fat, I've got about 37 pounds of fat on my body. Okay? So if I weigh 170 pounds and I have 37 pounds of fat on my body, I can take my body weight minus my fat weight and give my lean body weight. So 133 pounds of me is muscle, bone, skin, organs. So now that I've determined my lean body mass at 133 pounds, that's what I can, that's at 22% body fat. Let's say I want to drop down from 22% body fat to 15% body fat. So I can take my lean mass, I want to maintain that, right? And then I take 1.0 minus 15%, which is 0.15. And that will give me my desired fat range. So I take that, and then that will get me down to 156. So, right, if I'm 170 pounds now at 22% body fat, a acceptable weight range for me would be 156 at 15% body fat if I maintain my current lean tissue. Right? If I undergo training, I might increase my lean tissue mass, my bone mass, my skin, or my and muscle. Okay, so that can give me a better calculation rather than I need to lose 15 or 20 pounds. And lastly, we can look at circumference. Right? We can look at different body measurements and measure hypertrophy if that occurs after training. Okay, so that's a brief look at